The hatchling had not moved since morning. He lay curled at the center of the imperial nesting ground, a small bundle of dull gray scales pressed flat against the warm volcanic stone. His body rose and fell with each breath, but barely. If you were not watching closely, you might have missed it entirely. His tail was limp. His wings, still too small and soft to ever have carried him anywhere, were folded against his sides like wet paper. The copper color that should have covered every inch of him had faded 3 days ago, leaving behind something that looked more like ash than life. His name was Pip. No one had given him that name officially. Hatchlings in the Empire did not receive their true names until their flame burned strong and steady for the first time, a ceremony that every dragon family looked forward to from the moment the egg was laid. But Pip had never had a family to give him anything. He had been alone since the night he cracked open his shell and took his first cold breath into a world that had already taken everything from him. The healers called him the hatchling. The court advisors called him the last one. The Imperial guards who stood watch over the nesting ground through the long nights called him nothing at all, because naming something made it harder to watch it fade. But he was Pip, even if only the wind knew it yet. 3 dragon healers moved around him in slow, careful circles, their massive bodies casting long shadows across the stone. Each of them was ancient. Each of them had spent more years studying dragon medicine than most civilizations had spent existing. They had treated flame sickness, scale rot, wing fractures, and every manner of injury or illness that a dragon body could produce. They were the best in the Empire. They had been summoned the moment Pip stopped eating 2 days after his hatching, and they had not left since. None of them had helped him. The oldest healer, a large dragon whose deep green scales had gone gray at the edges with age, pressed one careful claw against Pip's side and closed his eyes. He stayed like that for a long moment, reading the hatchling's body the way his teachers had taught him, listening for the deep internal signals that told a trained healer what was wrong. He opened his eyes slowly. He said nothing. He stepped back and looked at the stone floor, and the 2 healers behind him understood from that single expression that he had found no new answer. They had tried heated stones placed against his sides through the night. They had burned rare herbs in clay pots around him and let the smoke drift across his scales. They had given him small amounts of mineral paste pressed carefully between his teeth, the same paste that had brought dozens of hatchlings back from the edge of cold death over the centuries. They had sung the old recovery chants that dragon mothers had used since before the Empire had a name. Every treatment that existed in every healing record in the Imperial Library had been attempted at least once. Pip lay still through all of it. His internal flame, the small but vital fire that every dragon hatchling carries in a special organ just below the chest, had gone completely cold. Without that flame cycling correctly, his body could not regulate its own warmth. Without warmth, his scales hardened wrong, his muscles weakened, his breathing slowed. The healers knew this. What they did not know was why it had happened, or how to reverse it when all the standard treatments had already failed. High above the nesting ground, on a wide flat ridge carved into the side of the black volcanic mountain, Emperor Gorith stood alone. He was enormous in the way that only very old, very powerful things can be enormous. His scales were the deep red of cooling magma, and they had not faded with age the way lesser dragons faded. His wings, folded against his back, were wide enough to block out a portion of the sky when he chose to spread them. He had ruled the Dragon Empire for longer than most of the species currently living on this planet had been alive. He had won wars, ended plagues, negotiated the survival of his people through 3 separate extinction-level events across 4 star systems. He was standing very still. His amber eyes were fixed on the small gray shape far below him in the nesting ground. He had not moved from that ridge since the previous morning. His advisors had come and gone with reports, with questions, with requests for decisions on matters of imperial importance. He had answered them in short, quiet words without ever moving his gaze away from Pip. The advisors had stopped coming. Gorith knew everything there was to know about the hatchling. He had been told the full story on the night of the hatching, delivered by the head of the Imperial Guard in a tone of careful, practiced neutrality that did nothing to soften the facts. The clutch had been 7 eggs, each one placed in a protected nest on the highest level of the nesting ground, safe from any weather, guarded at all hours. The mother had been strong and young and healthy. There had been no reason to expect anything other than a normal hatching. Then the storm had come. It was not a natural storm. No one had said that out loud, but Gorith knew it. The storms that reached the upper nesting grounds did not arrive by accident. Something had sent it, and the investigation into what and who was still ongoing, and none of that mattered at all right now because the result was the same regardless of the cause. The nest had been struck. The mother had thrown herself across the eggs in the final seconds, and she had saved them from the worst of it. All 7 eggs had survived the storm intact. But she had not. 6 of the 7 hatchlings had been too cold by the time the storm passed and the guards reached them. They were alive when they were found, but only just, and one by one through that first terrible night they had each gone still. The healers had done everything. It had not been enough. Pip had been the smallest of the 7. No one had expected him to be the one who made it through to morning. And yet there he was, still breathing, still faintly warm, blinking at the world with eyes that held a confusion so deep it looked almost like grief. He had survived. And then, slowly, steadily, over the days that followed, he had begun to fade anyway. Gorith watched the old healer step back from Pip and look at the floor. He understood what that meant. He had built an empire. He had armies and scholars and healers who were the finest in the known star systems. He had resources and ancient knowledge and power that most species in the galaxy could not imagine. And there was a hatchling dying in the courtyard below him, and he had nothing left to offer. That was the truth, plain and hard and immovable, sitting in his chest like cold stone. A small movement at the far edge of the nesting ground caught his eye. One of the human diplomats had stepped forward from the group that had been standing respectfully at the outer edge of the courtyard. They had arrived 2 days ago for trade discussions, a small team from the human diplomatic service, and they had been kept politely at a distance from the imperial proceedings. They were not important right now. They were a minor matter set aside until the more pressing one was resolved. The one who had stepped forward was a female. Small even by human standards. She was wearing the plain gray uniform of a field medic, and she was carrying a flat rectangular case in both hands. She had stopped a short distance from the healers and appeared to be speaking to the old green-scaled one. Gorith could not hear the words from the ridge. But he could see Dross turn toward her slowly. He could see the dismissive angle of the old healer's head, the slight shift of his wing that was the dragon equivalent of a door being closed. The human did not move back. She said something else. Dross spread one wing slightly wider. Gorith watched. Something about the stillness of the human caught his attention in a way he did not immediately understand. She was not backing down. She was not frightened. She was simply standing there in the ash-gray dirt of the nesting ground with her small case in both hands, looking at the hatchling and waiting. Gorith raised one claw. Dross stopped. He turned his head upward toward the ridge. Gorith held the position for one moment, then lowered his claw slowly and looked away. Dross stepped back. The human walked forward and knelt down beside Pip in the dirt without hesitating for even a second. She set her case down, opened it and began to work. She did not look up at the healers watching her. She did not look up at the ridge. She simply looked at Pip and got to work, and the courtyard went very, very quiet around her. High on the ridge, Gorith watched. He did not know what she was. He did not know what she could possibly do that his greatest healers had not already tried. He had no particular reason to believe in her. But Pip was still breathing. And that was enough reason to wait. Lena Ward had been standing at the edge of the courtyard for 2 hours before she finally decided to move. She had watched the healers work with the quiet, careful attention that years of field medicine had built into her. She did not pace. She did not whisper to her colleagues behind her. She simply stood with her medkit held in both hands and watched, and the longer she watched, the more certain she became that something important was being missed. She could not name it yet. She did not have enough information yet. But she had spent enough time around sick patients to know when a treatment plan was running out of road, and what she was watching had run out of road a long time ago. The hatchling had not moved in the entire time she had been standing there. She looked at her team leader, a tall man named Grant who was responsible for keeping the diplomatic visit running smoothly and who had already told her twice that morning to stay at the perimeter and not cause any problems. Grant was currently reviewing something on his handheld device and not paying attention to her. She looked back at the hatchling. She looked at the old green-scaled healer stepping back from Pip with that expression of quiet defeat that needed no translation in any language. She picked up her case and walked forward. She did not run. She did not hurry in a way that would draw the wrong kind of attention. She walked steadily across the ash-gray dirt of the courtyard the way she had walked into every difficult situation in her career, with her shoulders level and her eyes on the patient and her mind already working through the first set of questions she needed answered. Behind her she heard Grant say her name in a sharp, low voice. She did not stop. The lead healer was called Dross. She knew that from the briefing documents the diplomatic team had been given before landing. He was one of the oldest practicing healers in the Dragon Empire, with a reputation that stretched back further than most human nations had existed. He was enormous up close in a way that the briefing documents had not fully prepared her for. His scales were deep green fading to gray at the jaw and the edges of his wings, and his eyes when he turned them toward her were the pale yellow of old bone. He looked at her the way she imagined a mountain might look at a bird landing on it. She stopped a respectful distance away and spoke clearly. She told him she was a field medic with xenobiological training. She told him she had been observing the hatchling's condition from the perimeter and she believed she might have a useful perspective to offer. She asked, politely and directly, if she could examine the patient. The courtyard was not loud, but it got quieter. Dross regarded her for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then he spoke. His voice came through the translator device at her collar in flat, careful English, but the flatness did not hide the meaning underneath. He told her to return to the perimeter with her team. He told her the hatchling was under Imperial care and that every available treatment was already being applied by healers with centuries of experience. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Lena did not move. She knew how this looked. She was aware, very clearly aware, of exactly what Dross was seeing when he looked at her. A human female, shorter than any creature in this courtyard by a significant margin, with no fire, no wings, no ancient knowledge, no scales, no connection whatsoever to dragon biology or dragon tradition. She was soft in the way that dragons found deeply unimpressive. She was brief in the way that made long-lived species instinctively discount anything she might say. She was a visitor from a civilization that the Dragon Empire considered politely interesting at best and irrelevant at worst. She knew all of that. She asked again anyway. She kept her voice level and she said it differently this time. She did not argue about her qualifications. She did not list her credentials or her years of experience or the number of species she had treated in field conditions. Instead she said something simple. She said that she could see the current treatments were not producing results, and that sometimes a second pair of eyes from a completely different medical tradition found things that a single approach had missed, and that she was not asking to replace his judgment but only to add to it. She said she had no interest in being right. She only had an interest in the patient. Dross was quiet for a moment. Then he spread one wing slightly to the side. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was small and controlled, the way a door closes firmly without being slammed. In dragon body language it meant the conversation was finished. Lena had read enough of the cultural briefing to understand it clearly. She stayed where she was. She looked past Dross at Pip, lying still on the stone, his gray scales barely catching the morning light. She looked at the tiny rise and fall of his side. She looked at the cold flatness of his expression, that deep animal blankness that she had seen before in patients who were not in pain because they were too far gone to feel it anymore. Something settled in her chest, quiet and certain, the same feeling she had felt in field tents and emergency rooms and the backs of transports on difficult planets when she understood that the moment in front of her was one that she could either step into or step away from. She had never once stepped away. Dross began to turn back toward the hatchling. And then the ground changed. It was not a sound exactly. It was more like a pressure, a deep vibration that moved through the stone beneath her boots and up through her legs and into her chest before she heard anything at all. Then the shadow came. It fell across the courtyard from above, wide and dark, and every dragon in the space below shifted their weight and straightened their posture without appearing to think about it, the way grass bends when wind moves across a field. Lena looked up. Emperor Gorith had not moved from the ridge yet. He was still standing in the same position he had held for hours, enormous and still against the black mountain behind him. But his right foreleg had shifted. One claw was raised, extended slightly forward, held at a specific angle that meant nothing to Lena but apparently meant a great deal to everyone else in the courtyard. Dross had gone completely still. He was looking up at the ridge with his pale yellow eyes, and whatever he saw in that single raised claw made him close his wing. Slowly. Completely. He lowered it back to his side and stepped back one full pace from the hatchling. He did not look at Lena. He looked at the stone floor of the courtyard and he held his position there, and the two healers behind him did the same, and the Imperial guards along the walls did not move but something in their stillness changed quality entirely. Lena looked back up at the ridge. Gorith lowered his claw. He did not look at her. He turned his gaze back to the hatchling the same way it had been before, steady and unreadable from this distance, and he went still again as if the moment had not happened at all. But it had happened. Lena understood it clearly. He had not signaled approval of her. He had not expressed confidence in what she might do. He had simply removed the obstacle, in the same quiet, final way that a person might open a window not because they expected anything particular to fly in, but because the room had run out of air and something had to change. Pip was dying. The treatments had failed. And a small human medic was standing in his courtyard asking to try something different, and Gorith was a ruler who had survived as long as he had because he understood the difference between pride and practicality. He had nothing left to lose. Lena turned back to the hatchling and walked forward. She set her case down on the stone beside Pip and lowered herself to her knees. This close, she could hear his breathing, shallow and uneven, with a faint catch at the end of each exhale that told her more in 3 seconds than 2 hours of observation from the perimeter had managed to. She could feel the wrong kind of cold coming off his scales. Not the clean cold of a stone in shadow. The thin, fading cold of something losing its internal heat from the inside out. She opened her case. She did not look at the healers standing behind her. She did not look up at the ridge. She did not think about Grant at the perimeter with his device and his concerns about diplomatic smoothness. She thought about Pip. Only Pip. The small gray hatchling lying cold and still on the stone, who had survived a storm that took everyone else he had, and who had been fighting alone ever since. She got to work. The first thing Lena did was nothing. She knelt beside Pip and she was still for a full minute just looking at him. Not touching him yet. Not opening any of her instruments yet. Just looking the way her first mentor in field medicine had taught her when she was 22 years old and too eager and too fast. He had told her that the first minute belongs to the patient. You give it to them completely. You look and you listen and you let the situation tell you what it needs before you start deciding what you already know. She had never forgotten that. She looked at the way Pip was lying. He was curled tightly inward, his legs pulled close to his body, his tail wrapped around himself, his head tucked low. She had seen that position before in other species. Small creatures under extreme stress pulled inward like that, making themselves as compact as possible. It was not a sleeping position. It was a position of endurance. His body was doing the only thing it had left to do, which was hold everything together as tightly as possible and wait. She looked at his scales. Gray from the top of his head down to the tip of his tail, with no variation, no depth of color, no shine. Healthy dragon hatchling scales caught light and threw it back differently depending on angle and temperature. These caught the light and simply stopped it. She looked at his breathing. The shallow pull of air in, the slow uneven push out, that small catch at the end she had noticed the moment she knelt down. Something in the exhale was costing him effort it should not have been costing him. She began. She started with the basics, moving through her examination the same methodical way she moved through every patient regardless of species, because the basics existed for a reason and skipping them because a situation felt urgent was how doctors missed the simple answer hiding underneath the complicated one. She checked his surface temperature at 6 different points along his body using the small thermal reader from her kit. The readings were not uniform. That was the first thing that stood out clearly. A body losing heat from external cold lost it evenly from the outside in. Pip's temperature was irregular in a pattern that did not match external heat loss at all. It was inconsistent in a way that suggested the problem was internal, something generating and then failing to hold warmth rather than something simply cooling down. She made a note of that and kept moving. She checked his respiratory function, pressing 2 fingers gently against the side of his neck where the briefing documents had indicated the primary pulse point was located in dragon hatchlings. His pulse was there. Weak and uneven but there. She timed it for 60 seconds and noted the number. She checked the color of the membrane inside his lower eyelid, gently lifting it with one careful finger while he lay too still to react. The color was wrong. Too pale, too flat. She worked quietly through all of it and she talked to him the entire time. Not about what she was doing. Not medical observations spoken out loud. She simply talked to him the way she had talked to patients in the field who were too far gone to respond, because she had learned a long time ago that the voice did something that the hands alone could not do. It filled the space. It made the air around a patient feel occupied rather than empty. She did not know if Pip could hear her or understand anything about the sound she was making. She talked to him anyway. She told him he had done well to hold on this long. She told him she was going to figure out what was wrong. She told him that she had been in harder situations than this one, which was not entirely true, but it was the kind of thing that needed to be said out loud regardless of strict accuracy. She kept her voice low and even and steady, the same tone all the way through, no urgency in it, no fear, just the plain sound of one person being completely present with another. The courtyard around her was quiet. She was aware of the healers behind her. She was aware of the guards along the walls. She was aware, in a distant background way, of the enormous stillness on the ridge above. She did not let any of it into the small circle of focus she had drawn around herself and Pip. 2 hours into her examination she hit the wall that the dragon healers had already hit. Every reading she had taken, every observation she had made, pointed to the flame regulator. She knew enough about dragon hatchling biology from her xenobiology training to understand the organ's basic function. It sat just below the chest cavity, small in hatchlings, growing larger as the dragon matured. It cycled the internal fire that kept a young dragon's body temperature stable before their external flame developed fully. Without it working correctly, nothing else in the body could work correctly either. But she could not identify why it had failed. She sat back on her heels and looked at her notes on the small screen of her diagnostic pad. Everything she had recorded pointed to the same place and offered no explanation for how it had gotten there. She pressed 2 fingers against her mouth and thought. Around her, the courtyard had grown darker. The volcanic light from the mountain above had shifted as the hours passed, and someone had lit large stone braziers along the walls without her noticing. The warmth from them reached her back but not her front. She looked at Pip. He was still in the same position, pulled tight inward, enduring. She had been talking to him for 2 hours and he had not moved, had not reacted, had not given any visible sign that the sound of her voice was reaching him at all. But she kept talking anyway because stopping felt wrong in a way she could not explain precisely. She pulled up every piece of xenobiology research she had stored on her diagnostic pad related to dragon hatchling development. She read quickly, moving through papers she had looked at years ago during her training, skimming for anything she might have stored without fully absorbing at the time. Most of it she already knew. Flame development timelines, scale hardening processes, dietary requirements in the first weeks of life. And then she found it. It was not in the medical section of her research. It was in a behavioral biology paper she had downloaded 3 years ago and barely remembered reading. A single paragraph, buried in the middle of a longer discussion about early dragon development, written by a researcher who had spent time observing dragon nesting behavior in the wild rather than in controlled imperial settings. The paragraph described how dragon hatchlings in their first weeks of life outside the egg were not physiologically independent in the way that older dragons were. Their flame regulators did not operate on internal signals alone. They operated in response to external rhythmic stimulation. Specifically, the slow, steady rhythm of a heartbeat from a body pressed close to theirs. In a natural nest, this came from the mother. From the warmth of her body against them through the night. The flame regulator of a hatchling, the paper explained, was designed to follow an external rhythm until the hatchling was old enough to generate its own. Without that external rhythm to follow, it cycled erratically. And if the erratic cycling continued long enough, it stopped. Lena read the paragraph twice. Then she sat very still for a moment. Pip had been alone since the night he hatched. No mother. No nest. No heartbeat beside him through any of the nights that followed. The healers had treated his body with every remedy they knew. They had given him heat from stones. They had given him minerals and herbs and ancient chants. They had given him everything except the one thing his body was actually waiting for, because it was not a medical treatment. It was not in any healing record. It was a simple, biological need so basic that a species as ancient and powerful as the Dragon Empire had apparently stopped thinking about it long ago. He needed a heartbeat. Lena set her diagnostic pad down on the stone. She looked at Pip for a moment. She thought briefly about how this was going to look to the healers behind her, to the guards along the walls, to the enormous ancient emperor on the ridge above. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Then she reached out and carefully, gently, with both hands she picked Pip up. He was lighter than she expected and colder than she had prepared herself for. She brought him in against her chest and held him there, both arms around him, his head resting just below her collarbone. She felt him tense slightly at the contact, a small involuntary tightening of his body, the reflex of something that had learned not to expect warmth from the outside world. She breathed in slowly. She breathed out slowly. She held the rhythm steady and even, and she kept talking to him, the same low quiet voice she had been using all night, and she let her heart do the rest. Behind her, she heard one of the healers make a low sound. She did not turn around. The night passed slowly. Lena did not sleep. She had not expected to sleep and she had not tried. She sat with her back against the warm volcanic stone of the nesting ground wall, her legs crossed beneath her, Pip held against her chest with both arms. She kept her breathing slow and deliberate, in and out, the same steady rhythm hour after hour. Her arms grew heavy. Her back ached from the position. The stone beneath her was hard in the way that only stone can be hard after you have been sitting on it for several hours without moving. She did not shift. She did not adjust. She stayed still. The courtyard around her had changed during the night. The dragon healers had not left. She had expected them to withdraw once she had done the thing that had clearly confused and offended them in equal measure, but they had stayed. They stood at a distance, the 3 of them, and they watched her with those pale ancient eyes in a way that she felt on her skin without looking at them. The Imperial guards along the walls had stayed too. No one had spoken to her since she picked Pip up. No one had approached her. The courtyard had settled into a deep, specific silence that had weight to it, the silence of many large creatures holding very still and waiting to see what happened next. The braziers along the walls burned low and steady. Lena talked to Pip through the early part of the night, keeping her voice quiet, keeping the sound of it even and unrushed. She talked about small things. She described the city she had grown up in, the gray winters and the way the light came through in spring after months of cold. She told him about the first patient she had ever lost, a small detail she had never told anyone because there was never a right moment, and somehow the dark courtyard and the sleeping hatchling and the long quiet hours made it feel like the right moment. She told him about the planet she had been stationed on for 2 years before joining the diplomatic service, a hot, flat world with red soil and skies that turned green at sunset. She was not sure why she was telling him any of it. He was a dragon hatchling who could not understand a single word she said. But the talking kept her breathing steady, and steady breathing was the whole point right now. Around the middle of the night she stopped talking and just breathed. She started to notice things in the quiet. Small things. The way Pip's body, which had been rigid and tightly curled when she first picked him up, had gradually softened over the first hour. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But degree by degree, the way ice does not melt in a single moment but gives itself up to warmth slowly and without announcement. His legs were no longer pulled so tightly to his body. His tail, which had been wrapped around himself like a closing fist, had relaxed and now draped loosely across her knee. His head, which had been tucked down hard against his chest, had shifted slightly upward so that his nose rested just below her collarbone. She noticed that his breathing had changed too. It was still shallow. Still slower than it should have been. But the uneven catch at the end of each exhale, the small effortful hitch she had heard the moment she first knelt beside him, had smoothed out somewhere in the second hour. She had not caught the exact moment it changed. She had simply realized at some point that she was no longer hearing it, and that the absence of it felt significant enough that she held her own breath for a moment just to make sure she was not imagining things. She was not imagining things. She let out her breath and kept going. The volcanic light above the mountain began to change somewhere around the 5th hour. The deep red-black of the night sky shifted at its edges, not to anything as simple as blue, but to a darker, richer version of the red that dominated the sky on this world at all hours. The braziers along the walls seemed dimmer by contrast as the sky slowly brightened. The guards shifted their weight. One of the healers, the oldest one, moved slightly closer than he had been before, not close enough to intrude but close enough that Lena was aware of the change. She looked down at Pip. She almost missed it the first time because she was not expecting it and because it was so small. A faint warmth against her chest, different from the gradually increasing body warmth she had been feeling for the past few hours. A warmth that came and went in a single second like a match being struck and then immediately covered. She looked down at the top of Pip's head. His scales were still gray. She waited. It happened again. A tiny pulse of warmth, there and gone like something small trying to remember how to work. She tilted her chin down and watched the space just above his nose. The light in the courtyard was still low but growing, and she watched the exact spot with the focused attention of someone who has learned to trust small signals. The third time it happened she saw it. A thread of flame, barely the width of her finger, curled from Pip's left nostril and disappeared into the air above him in less than a second. It was pale orange, almost yellow, the color of a flame that has very little fuel behind it yet. It was gone before she could have pointed to it or described it to anyone. But she had seen it. She had felt the warmth of it against the underside of her chin. She pressed her lips together and said nothing. She breathed in. She breathed out. 30 seconds later it happened again, and this time it lasted a full 2 seconds and the color was deeper. And then again a minute after that, stronger still. And with each small thread of flame that curled upward and dissolved, she felt the warmth against her chest grow more consistent, less like pulses and more like something settling into a steady rhythm of its own, finding its pace. Following the rhythm she had been giving it all night and slowly, gradually, beginning to generate one of its own. The gray at the edges of Pip's scales began to change. It started at the base of his neck, just below his jaw, a small area no wider than Lena's hand. The gray did not disappear all at once. It deepened first, shifting toward brown, and then the brown warmed toward amber, and the amber brightened toward copper, and the copper spread outward from that first small point the way color spreads through water when you add a single drop of dye to it. Slowly. Completely. Unstoppably. By the time the sky above the volcanic mountain had fully shifted to its morning red, Pip's scales from the top of his head to the curve of his tail were the deep warm copper they had always been meant to be. Lena looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes and let out one long, slow breath. The ground moved. She felt it before she heard it, the same deep vibration from the stone beneath her that she had felt once before, the pressure that moved up through the floor and into the body before the sound caught up with it. She opened her eyes. The shadow came first, enormous and fast, cutting across the courtyard from above and darkening the space around her completely for a single second. Then the sound, a deep concussive impact as something vast and heavy landed on the stone floor of the nesting ground, close enough that the displaced air moved her hair and pressed against her face. She looked up. Emperor Gorith was standing 10 feet in front of her. Up on the ridge he had been large in the way that distant things are large, impressive in scale but contained by distance. Down here in the courtyard with nothing between them, he was something else entirely. He was larger than the building she had grown up in. His head alone, held low on his long neck as he looked at her, was bigger than the transport vehicle that had brought her team to the homeworld. His scales in the morning light were the deep red of something that had been burning for a very long time. His eyes, those amber eyes she had seen as small distant points of light from the perimeter, were extraordinary up close. They were not simply amber. They were amber the way ancient things are amber, with depth and layers and something moving far back inside them that had nothing to do with simple color. He looked at Pip. He was still for a long moment, looking at the hatchling glowing copper and warm against the chest of a human woman sitting cross-legged in the ash-gray dirt of his imperial nesting ground. His expression did not change in any way that Lena could read. But something in the quality of his stillness was different from the stillness she had observed all night on the ridge. That had been the stillness of waiting. This was something else. He looked at her. The translator device at her collar had gone warm, which meant it was active and working. When Gorith spoke, his voice came through it in plain, careful English, each word placed with the deliberate weight of something that did not speak lightly or often in any language other than its own. He said 2 words. "What are you?" It was not quite a question. It was not quite a statement. It sat somewhere between the two, in a space that felt like genuine uncertainty from a creature that Lena suspected did not experience genuine uncertainty very often. She looked up at him. She was aware of how she looked, sitting on the ground covered in ash-gray dust, her uniform creased from a night without movement, her hair pulled back in a way that had stopped being neat approximately 6 hours ago. She was aware of the healers behind her and the guards along the walls and the complete silence of the courtyard around this moment. She looked down at Pip, warm and copper and breathing steadily against her chest. She looked back up at Gorith. "A doctor," she said. "And apparently a temporary nest." Gorith did not leave. That was the first thing Lena noticed after the silence that followed her answer. She had half expected him to turn and go back to his ridge, having seen what he came down to see, satisfied or unsatisfied, returning to the elevated distance where emperors belonged. But he did not turn. He did not spread his wings. He lowered himself slowly to the ground instead, folding his front legs beneath him and settling his enormous body onto the stone of the courtyard with a heaviness that Lena felt through the floor. He was not close enough to crowd her. But he was close enough that she was aware of the warmth coming off his scales, a deep steady heat that was completely different from the volcanic warmth of the braziers. It was alive in a way that stone heat was not. He looked at Pip for a long moment without speaking. Lena looked at Pip too. The hatchling was still asleep against her chest, his copper scales rising and falling with each breath, a faint warmth pulsing from him at steady intervals now. His tail had curled loosely around her forearm at some point in the last hour, not tightly, just resting there, the way a sleeping creature reaches toward warmth without waking up to do it consciously. She had not moved her arm. She had not shifted him. She had stayed exactly as she was and let him hold on. Gorith spoke. The translator device rendered his words in the same flat, careful English as before, each word landing with the weight of something chosen deliberately. He asked her how she had known what to do. Not how she had known the biology, not where she had found the information. How she had known. There was a difference in the question that she caught immediately, the difference between asking about a process and asking about something that lived underneath the process. She thought about the answer for a moment before giving it. She told him the truth, which was that she had not known at first. She had worked through the standard examination the same way she worked through every examination, methodically and without assumptions, and the biology had come from a research paper she had read years ago and nearly forgotten. That part was straightforward. That part was training and memory and the habit of keeping detailed records on her diagnostic pad. But that was not what had told her what Pip actually needed. She paused. Outside, the morning sky had deepened to its full red, and the courtyard was fully lit now, the braziers looking pale and unnecessary in the daylight. She could hear the distant sound of the imperial city waking up beyond the walls, the low rumble of a civilization going about its morning. She told Gorith that she had recognized something in Pip before she found the research paper. She had seen it in the way he was lying, in the position he had locked himself into, in the specific quality of his stillness. She had seen it before. Not in dragons. In humans, in other species she had treated in field conditions, in patients who had arrived at her care with every physical problem correctly identified and every physical treatment correctly applied and who were still fading anyway, still losing ground, still giving up territory inside themselves that medicine alone could not hold. Gorith was listening. She could feel the quality of his attention the same way you can feel weather changing, a pressure shift in the air around her. She told him that loneliness had a specific presentation in a patient. It was not dramatic. It was quiet. It looked like cooperation with treatment while something underneath the treatment was simply not engaging. It looked like a body going through the correct motions of recovery while something deeper had stopped believing recovery was coming. She had seen it in elderly patients who had recovered physically from illness but whose families had stopped visiting. She had seen it in young patients in long-term care who smiled when the medical staff came and went completely still when they left. She had seen it in field conditions in soldiers who were physically stable but had lost their unit and could not find a reason to push through the last part of getting better. She had seen it in Pip the moment she knelt beside him. Everything that was wrong with him medically came back to the flame regulator, and the flame regulator had failed because it was waiting for something it had never received. But underneath the biology, underneath the specific mechanics of what had gone wrong and why, there was something simpler. There was a very small creature who had come into the world and found nothing there to come into. No warmth waiting for him. No heartbeat beside him. No presence that said you are here and I know you are here and that matters. She told Gorith that the body sometimes did not need medicine. Sometimes it needed to know it was not alone. She said it plainly, without weight or drama, the way she said most true things, because in her experience the true things did not need decoration. They stood up on their own if you just said them straight. The courtyard was very quiet. Gorith looked at Pip for a long time after that. The hatchling shifted slightly in his sleep, a small unconscious adjustment, pressing incrementally closer to the warmth of Lena's chest. His copper scales caught the morning light and held it, glowing faintly, steadily the way healthy young things glow when they are finally warm enough. When Gorith spoke again his voice was different. Not in volume. Not in the careful deliberate placement of each word. But in something underneath the words, a quality that had not been there in the question he had asked before. Something that had been held at a distance and was now very slightly less distant. He told her about the storm. He did not begin with it directly. He began by telling her that Pip was not an ordinary hatchling, and then he stopped as if deciding how much further to go, and then he went further. He told her that Pip was the last survivor of a clutch of 7 eggs. He said the number plainly, 7, and let it sit in the air between them without commentary. He told her the clutch had been placed in a protected nest on the highest level of the nesting ground, safe from weather, guarded at all hours by Imperial guards whose sole responsibility was the security of that nest. There had been no reason to expect anything to go wrong. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. Then he told her about the storm. He said it had not been natural. He said the investigation was ongoing and he did not elaborate on that, closing that particular door with the same quiet finality that Dross had tried to close on Lena the previous morning, and she did not push against it. What he told her instead was what the storm had done when it reached the nest. It had come fast and it had come hard and there had been very little time between the alarm being raised and the worst of it arriving. Pip's mother had covered the eggs. Gorith said it simply. She had put herself over all 7 of them and she had held her position through the full force of what hit that nest. And when it was over all 7 eggs were intact and she was not. He did not describe the details of what not intact meant for her. He did not need to. Lena understood. The guards had reached the nest within minutes of the storm passing. 6 of the 7 hatchlings had already cracked their shells in the chaos and cold, born too early into air that was wrong for them, and one by one through that first night they had each gone still despite everything the healers tried. Pip had been the last egg to crack. He had come out smallest and coldest and least expected to last the night. He had lasted. But he had opened his eyes into a nest with no mother and no siblings and nothing warm beside him at all, and his flame regulator had done exactly what it was designed to do, which was wait for a heartbeat to follow. And none had come. Gorith was quiet for a moment after he finished. Lena looked at Pip. She thought about 7 eggs in a nest and a mother throwing herself across all of them in the dark, and one small hatchling cracking his shell last into the cold quiet aftermath of all of that. She thought about how many nights he had been lying in that courtyard waiting for something his body knew should be there, something ancient and biological and simple, while the greatest healers in the Empire moved around him with their centuries of knowledge and their heated stones and their chants. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly that he had held on for a long time by himself. Gorith looked at Pip. Something moved in those amber eyes, deep and slow, the way things move at the bottom of very old water. He said yes. He said it in the old tongue first before the translator caught it, one low sound that needed no translation at all. Then the English word came through the device, small and plain. Yes. The morning light spread across the courtyard and Pip slept on, warm and copper and breathing steadily, and neither of them said anything else for a while. They did not need to. Some things were already said in the simple fact of the three of them sitting together in the morning light, the Emperor and the Doctor and the small hatchling between them who had needed nothing more than a heartbeat and had finally found one. 3 days passed before Gorith called the court together. Lena did not know he was planning it. No one told her. She spent those 3 days in the Imperial guest quarters with Pip, who had decided on the morning after his recovery that Lena was his and that the matter was not open for discussion. He followed her from room to room. He slept at the foot of her sleeping mat and was there every morning when she opened her eyes, sitting upright and watching her with the focused intensity of a creature who had decided that losing sight of her was not something he was prepared to risk. When she sat down he climbed into her lap. When she stood up he pressed against her leg. When she ate he sat beside her plate and watched each bite with enormous copper eyes until she gave him a small piece of whatever she was having, which he accepted with great seriousness and then immediately wanted another one. The diplomatic team watched all of this with a range of expressions. Grant, her team leader, had stopped being annoyed about the disruption to protocol approximately 1 day in, when Pip had climbed onto the diplomatic meeting table during a trade discussion and gone to sleep directly on top of the document Grant had been presenting. After that Grant had simply started scheduling meetings around Pip's nap times, which Lena found privately very funny and did not say out loud. The Dragon Court staff who brought meals and managed the guest quarters were harder to read. They were professional and correct in everything they did, but she caught them watching Pip sometimes, watching the easy way he moved around her, the small sounds he made when she picked him up, the way his scales brightened slightly when she walked into a room. She did not know what those watching expressions meant exactly. She only knew they were not the same expression she had seen on the first day. On the morning of the 4th day a formal messenger arrived at her quarters. He was a young dragon, his scales still bright with the particular shine of youth, carrying a scroll of pressed volcanic stone etched with imperial marks that her translator device identified as a summons to the Great Court. The message was formal and brief. Her presence was requested. The entire diplomatic team was requested. The time was midday. Lena looked at Pip, who was sitting on her sleeping mat watching the messenger with deep suspicion. She looked back at the messenger and said they would be there. The Great Court was not a room. That was the first thing she understood when they were led into it. It was a space carved from the mountain itself, open to the sky above through a gap in the volcanic rock that ran the full length of the ceiling and let in a column of red morning light wide enough to land a transport in. The walls were black stone, ancient and smooth, covered in markings that her translator device rendered in pieces, fragments of history and law and names going back further than she could follow. The floor was flat volcanic glass, dark and reflective, and their footsteps sounded very small in it. The court was full. Dragons filled the space along both sides, standing in rows that stretched back into the shadows at the edges of the light. She did not try to count them. There were very many. Their scales caught the column of light from above and threw it back in fragments of red and green and deep blue and gold, and the collective warmth of that many large bodies in one space was something she felt on her skin immediately, a dry living heat that was completely different from the volcanic warmth of the mountain. Every eye in the room was on her. Pip pressed against her leg and she reached down without thinking and put her hand on his back. He leaned into her hand and stayed there. Gorith was at the far end of the court. He was seated on a formation of volcanic rock that had not been shaped so much as grown into the specific arrangement it held, built up over centuries by the slow patient work of the mountain itself into something that was a throne without ever having been made into one. He was larger here than he had seemed even in the courtyard, or perhaps it was the formal stillness of the setting that made him larger, the way certain people expand to fill the space that ceremony gives them. He waited until the full diplomatic team had entered and taken their positions. Then he spoke. His voice filled the great court completely, reaching every wall and coming back, not as an echo exactly but as a fullness, a sound that occupied the space rather than simply crossing it. The translator device at Lena's collar worked steadily, rendering the old tongue into English word by careful word. He began by addressing his court. He told them that 3 days ago a hatchling had been dying in the Imperial nesting ground and that every healer and every remedy the Empire possessed had failed to save him. He stated this plainly without softening it or framing it differently, and the court received it in silence. He told them that a human medic from the diplomatic envoy had stepped forward and asked to examine the patient. He told them that she had been turned away once and had not accepted it. He told them what she had done through the night, the examination, the research, and the simple act of holding a cold hatchling against her chest and breathing slowly until his flame remembered how to follow a rhythm. He told them that by sunrise Pip was alive and warm and his scales were copper again. The court was absolutely still. Gorith looked at Lena directly then and spoke to her rather than to the room, though his voice carried to every corner of it regardless. He said that in the history of the Dragon Empire, the title of Bonded Guardian had been held only by dragons. It was not a law that had ever needed to be written down because the circumstance of a non-dragon being considered for it had never arisen. It was simply the way things were, the way many things in a very old civilization were simply the way things were because they had always been that way and no situation had ever demanded that anyone examine them. He said he was examining it now. He said the title of Bonded Guardian to Pip, last hatchling of his clutch, ward of the Imperial Court, was being offered to Dr. Lena Ward of the Human Diplomatic Service. The silence in the great court changed quality. It had been the silence of attention before. Now it was the silence of something larger, the silence of many ancient minds receiving a fact that had no existing place to go and making room for it in real time. She heard the shift in it, felt it in the air of the room. Pip looked up at her. She looked down at him. His copper scales were bright in the column of light from above. His eyes were steady and completely certain in the way that only very young creatures and very old ones manage to be certain, without doubt and without performance, just the plain simple fact of what they knew. She looked back at Gorith and said yes. He dipped his head once. It was a small movement for a creature of his size, which made it feel larger rather than smaller. Then he did something she had not expected. He kept speaking. He turned back to his court and he talked to them, and what he said was not ceremony or formal declaration. It was something else. His voice was the same volume, the same weight, but the quality underneath it had changed, the way a formal document changes when someone stops reading it and starts meaning it. He told them that he had ruled the Empire for a very long time. He told them that in that time he had observed most of the species that moved through the star systems his empire occupied or bordered or simply shared the universe with. He had observed them with the particular confidence of a civilization that had been old when most of those species were still learning to make fire, a confidence that had not always been arrogance but had perhaps, over centuries, become difficult to distinguish from it. He told them that humans had not impressed him. He said it directly, without apology, because it was true and his court knew it was true, and dressing it in softer words would not have served what he was trying to say. Humans were brief. They were soft. They had no fire in their bodies, no scales, no wings, no centuries of accumulated power behind them. They were small and fast-living, and the things they built did not last the way dragon things lasted. He had looked at them for a long time and seen creatures passing through a universe that had been ancient before their world had cooled, and he had not looked more carefully than that. He paused. The great court waited. He looked at Pip, standing against Lena's leg in a column of red light, warm and alive and copper-bright. He said he had been wrong. He said it the same way Lena said true things, plainly, without decoration, letting it stand on its own weight. He said that he had spent centuries looking for fire in the places he knew fire lived, in the throat, in the scales, in the ancient accumulated force of a civilization that had outlasted everything around it. He said he had not thought to look in the places that did not advertise themselves. In the quiet. In the patience. In the willingness of one small soft creature to sit on a cold stone floor through an entire night holding something that was dying and simply refuse to agree that it was over. He stopped. The court was perfectly silent. When he spoke again his voice was quieter. Not softer. Quieter, the difference being that soft things lose their edges and quiet things keep them. He said it slowly, one piece at a time. They carry no fire in their throats. He paused. They carry it inside. The words landed in the great court and did not echo. They simply stayed, the way true things stay, filling the space without needing the walls to give them back. Lena stood in the column of red light with Pip pressed warm against her leg, and she did not say anything. There was nothing to add. She looked at the ancient emperor who had just told his entire civilization that he had been wrong about something, which she suspected was not a thing that happened in this room very often, and she thought that it took a specific kind of strength to do that, a kind that had nothing to do with fire or scales or centuries of power. She reached down and put her hand on Pip's back. He leaned into it the way he always did, completely and without hesitation, and his scales were warm beneath her palm, steady and alive and copper-bright in the morning light. Outside the mountain, the Imperial City went about its day. Somewhere in the diplomatic wing, Grant was probably rescheduling something. The universe continued in all its old indifferent vastness, full of species and civilizations and the long slow business of existing. And in the great court of the Dragon Empire, a small hatchling stood in a column of light beside the human woman who had held him through the coldest night of his life, and the warmth between them was not dramatic or ancient or built from centuries of accumulated power. It was just warmth, which had always been exactly enough.